Good morning, everyone. I just waiting for some more people to sign in. I know the meeting invite said 10:45 to 1. So, but we did plan on it to start at 11. Um, so meanwhile, y'all could look at my fuzzy little face. Glad you could join us, Ethan. Are you in Eleuthera?
Yes, I'm at the preserve.
Okay, excellent.
And how are things on Grand Bahama these days?
It's very interesting. Actually, the nursery is getting set up, and I've been able to bring into propagation some different native plants. And so we have some Lignum vitae from Staniel Key just germinated. Um, we have a bunch of strongback that sprung up. I'm trying to get some of our native sage, the lantana involucrata, white sage,
Mhm.
um, and trying to see how they do from seed as well as from cuttings later on. And
We
then
had
we
we had
collected a
good.
bunch of pines yesterday.
Ooh, I'd be interested to hear how your pine stuff goes. Have you been in contact with
Naki.
Naki down in
Yeah, so we have their
India?
protocols.
Okay, good.
We have their protocols and we're using those. And then the pine cones that we collected yesterday were from someone bulldozed a bunch of pines, and so we kind of like just picked up all the pine cones that we could get our hands on, and so the nursery technician is shaking them out to get the pine seeds. We'll see what comes of that. Trying to do some into native soil, some into like store-bought soil.
It'll help if you can go get some broken like wood chip and stuff like that, and branches and bark and stuff like that, and mix it in.
Okay. Yeah, Nike, those their protocol does indicate that a lot of that mycorrhizae and just having stuff from the environment to make that pH a little bit more friendly to the plants as they would expect. That would be good. The restoration sites that we're doing though, the way they scrape them bare, it's just like terrible for anything. And then like yeah,
Doing restoration in a pineland that's been scraped.
yeah,
Good luck with that.
yeah. Thank
You're gonna
you.
spend a lot of time on a very small area.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I've been trying to tell them, and I think there isn't enough of a body of like a history of work for people to make a proper estimation of how much it costs, and so a lot of things were promised without the background data, and so trying to
Right.
rein in expectations.
I'm so shocked and surprised that things are overpromised and underdelivered.
Yeah.
Shocking.
Just quickly while we wait, Salome, do you want to check that you can share your screen okay?
Yes, please. I'm gonna, wait, inhabilit. So it's not possible for me to share my screen. It says that the host needs to let me do that.
Okay, yeah. So if you could make,
Hey, could you
oh,
try
can you do it now?
again, please? Could you try again, please, Salome?
Yeah, it's now it's
Alrighty.
can you see it good?
Yes, and the full screening has worked fine today, which is good.
Perfect.
I will also just double check that I can share mine. Okay. So if you could stop sharing your screen, then I'll just check mine is okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then I have to do my usual switching of making sure I'm displaying them right. Cool. Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay. That's a good start.
Yeah.
We are T-1. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this introductory workshop for the green status of species. I am Dr. Ancilleno Davis, and I own the Science and Perspective brand, and Science and Perspective is supporting this workshop by providing the Zoom platform and the recording, which will be posted onto YouTube. Today, we have joining us several guests who will guide us through the green status of species. We have Dr. Ross Kennerly. She's the co-chair of the IUCN SSC Small Mammal Specialist Group, and this includes the Bahamian Hutia. And Ross has also worked in other parts of the Caribbean on sister species in Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Jamaica. Dr. Becca Young is a Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust Conservation Impact Manager and member of the IUCN Green Status of Species Working Group. And Becca has worked with a range of international organizations on green status of species assessments from a wide variety of taxa and in different geographical locations. Salome Lopez is the IUCN Green Status of Species intern with Durrell Wildlife Conservation Trust. And Salome is supporting the IUCN Green Status of Species Working Group and the SSC Small Mammal Specialist Group by working with species experts to draft green status of species assessments for small mammals from a range of geographical locations, including Europe, Brazil, North America, and the Bahamas. So as we go through today's workshop, in this workshop setting in Zoom, we'd like everyone to keep their videos closed until you are presenting so that we can save on bandwidth and make sure that our partners in the Bahamas and around the world can get the best experience possible. The recording will be made available to everyone who has signed up and practitioners in the Bahamas for the future so that they can use it to form their own green status assessments as well. I will now allow Becca, will you go first, or which one of you will go first?
No, Salome is going to go first.
Okay.
So just to give you a little bit of an idea, everyone, of the structure. So Salome is going to start off with a bit of a general introduction to the green status. Then we'll have a bit of time for a Q&A. So if you've got any questions, anything that maybe comes up during Salome's presentation that's a little bit unclear, then we can go through questions on that and answer any questions you have. Then I'll do just kind of quite a brief summary presentations of some of the challenges that we sometimes have people raising, maybe some concerns when they're thinking about doing an assessment, but also some of the benefits of doing the assessment. And then we're going to hone in more on the Bahamian Hutia assessment specifically. So this is one that Salome has been working on doing an initial draft for. You may have seen the document that she shared around, which is starting to collect information. So this is a great opportunity for us to sort of tap into the minds of people with expertise on this species to help get input on the suggestions that Salome has made and to help us progress this assessment forward so that we can prepare something for publication on the Red List website. So just something to note in terms of the fact that obviously this is being recorded and people might revisit this at a later date. So obviously we're working on the moment at the preliminary assessment level for the Bahamian Hutia. And so this is all sort of the initial thinkings around this assessment with the end goal of us being able to produce an assessment which will go for review and publication. So after that sort of brief summary of what we're going to do, I will hand over to Salome to start the presentations for you.
Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you,
for those
Becca.
who have joined, please feel free to put your contact information in the chat and we'll compile those so we can continue communications later, although we do have most of us. And for those of you who are using an organizational sign-in, if you could share who all is in the room with you, that would be great. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Becca. If you can see it, okay. Is it okay?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, cool. Well, like Dr. Ancilleno said, I'm Salome, and I'm doing an internship with the Green Status of Species, and I will be introducing the framework to you, which is a framework for quantifying measures of species recovery and conservation success. Ay, no me pasa. Ah, it's frozen. Sorry, let me just try again. Okay, cool. There we go. So the international conservation metrics like the IUCN Red List of Threatened Species has focused on assessing extinction risk and has played a fundamental role in documenting and monitoring the state of biodiversity. And these conservation efforts have focused mainly on avoiding extinction and reducing rates of decline. Conversely, the green status is envisioned to quantify species recovery, to incentivize conservation levels beyond those necessary to avoid extinction, and to provide metrics for measuring conservation success in terms of progress towards recovery. So the main objective of the green status is to push conservation for species not only to survive, but also to thrive. The status evaluates conservation success in two different ways. The first one is by providing a standardized measurement of how close a species is from being fully recovered from human impacts, and this is reflected by the species recovery score, and also by estimating the impact of past conservation, of past and potential future conservation on species progress towards recovery, and this is reflected by the conservation impact metrics. So recovery is central to a green status, but we haven't defined it yet. One innovative aspect of the framework is to provision a standardized definition of recovery, which was previously lacking. And this definition is that that for a species to be fully considered fully recovered, it must be viable and exhibit its ecological interactions, all the functions and the roles in the ecosystem, and occur in a representative set of ecosystems and communities throughout the indigenous range. So this definition recognizes three dimensions of recovery. One is the viability as the minimum requirement for recognizing a species as recovered. When a species is recovered and it's functional, it has the attribute, and it's viable, it has the attributes necessary for long-term persistence, and therefore it's at a very low risk of extinction. The second dimension, which is a novel within the green status framework, is functionality, because an ecological functional population has the abundance, density, and the appropriate demographic structure that allows all the ecological interactions to take place. Functionality is considered within the green status assessment in order to restore species to level higher than what is required only for viability. And so when we're introducing functionality, it's a way of expecting more conservation efforts, and it's also an opportunity to insert ecological theory into conservation practice. And the third dimension is representation, because a fully recovered species occurs in a representative set of ecosystems and communities throughout the range. So now for the objectives of the framework, there are 5, and they are each associated with the metrics that we aim to measure within an assessment. The first objective is to provide a standardized framework for measuring species recovery, and it's reflected by the species recovery score, as I mentioned before. And now for the definition of this recovery score, it's that it's a measure of how close the species is to being fully recovered, and it is based on the observed, estimated, inferred, or suspected condition of the species at the time of the assessment. The second objective is to recognize conservation achievement. This is reflected by the conservation legacy metric, which measures the impact of conservation actions that have been conducted to date. With this objective, we're trying to answer the question, what was the impact of past conservation actions and what would have happened without conservation actions? The third objective is to highlight species whose current conservation status is dependent on continued conservation action, and this is associated with the metric conservation dependence, which measures the impact of ongoing conservation actions if all conservation actions were to cease at the moment of the assessment. And so this tries to answer the questions, what happens short term without conservation action. The fourth objective is to forecast the expected conservation impact of plant conservation action, and it's associated with the metric conservation gain, which measures the impact of ongoing and planned conservation action, and it answers the question, what happens short term if we keep doing conservation actions that are planned? The fifth objective is to elevate levels of ambition for long-term species recovery, and it's associated with the recovery potential metric, which quantifies conservation aspiration at the maximum plus plausible improvement of the species status in the long term, given conservation, innovation, and sustained conservation. And so these are the categories, and we will be looking into them in the coming slides. So now, with these 5 metrics together, what we're doing is that we are assessing the species' current recovery status and evaluating the past and potential future of its impact on conservation status. So now that we have discussed the intention of the green status, we have how it has provided a standardized framework and how its objectives relate to the metrics that we aim to measure. We can discuss how green status assessment is conducted. So the first thing is to remember that the definition of recovered has 3 components or different components. If a species is considered fully recovered when it's viable and ecologically functioning in each part of its range, we first need to start by defining the range. So this is the first step. The range is, or the indigenous range, which is central to the green status, is defined as the known or inferred distribution generated from historical records or physical evidence of the species occurrence. And this is both past or historical and current. It should be assessed at a time far back enough to avoid shifting baselines and recognize contractions or expansions that are associated with human activity. So that they should be set at a time before human beings were the most important element limiting the species distribution and abundance. So when you're doing a green status assessment, what you need to do is to first identify the approximate year when humans started impacting the species distribution, and then infer the distribution at this date. So you would use resources and inference methods like historical records, insights from traditional knowledge, species specialists, data sets, and so on, to try to determine the range at the event. Okay. And so this approximate year when humans started impacting the species is referred within the framework as the benchmark year. So you would have to define the species range by the benchmark year. In this example that I have here, this is the great prairie chicken. This is the distribution range of the species. So the indigenous range, which is the lighter blue, and the present range, which is the dark blue. And for the species, the indigenous range was determined by 1750, and you can see the difference between what we aim to look, which is the whole distribution of the species, the historic distribution by this benchmark. The next aspect that we need to consider is the spatial unit, and they are used to incorporate representation. The unit should capture variation and incentivize recovery across all parts of the range, and have representation in all of the systems that the species has historically occurred. This is a key part of the assessment, and they can be delineated by species-specific biological subdivisions, ecological features, geological features, locations, and grid cells. For example, locations are countries, species-specific biological subdivisions can be subpopulations or subspecies. For the prairie chicken, the special units were defined using landscape conservation cooperative regions that were based on ecological attributes, and they reflect landscape habitat features that are important to drive prairie chicken population demography. And so,
Pardon me, Salome.
Yeah.
Sorry, you're getting quieter to us. I don't know if you're like moving away from the microphone or something.
No,
but
sorry. Is this better?
that is much better. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my microphone was sleeping. I'm sorry.
Okay. Thank
Okay.
you.
Cool. So I was saying that in the prairie chicken, they identified 6 special units, and they were based on geological features. So this is an example that I pulled, but I wanna bring back the discussion for just a minute to show you what I proposed for the Hutia, and we will go back to it in the workshop. But just to kind of give you the idea for this species, what I proposed as the indigenous range is the Great Bahamian Bank, because according to, or what I found was that according to fossil records, the species is thought to have been original to this area. And for the benchmark year, I proposed that it should be 1500, because according to the green status guidelines, when a species distribution has been affected by humans before this date, that's the cutoff for the conservation to be included within modern conservation. So because for the Hutia, the Lucasians were impacting the region before this year, we have to set it by the 1500. And also the special units, I propose them to be the different islands, because it's unlikely that the species would have dispersed naturally between the islands. So they would be more likely closed populations. But we will come back to this later. Well, okay, so moving on the assessment, the third step is to determine functionality. Within the green cities assessment, functionality is important because we're considering interactions for conservation. A population within a special unit should be considered functional if it is at the largest density and abundance that's needed for the identified functions to take place. And it's also important, the population structure. So the functionality is related to density, abundance, and population structure. So what you would need to do when you're doing an assessment is to identify species functions, the traits that are associated with these functions, and the characteristics of the population that will determine if it's fulfilling or not the function. Or otherwise look for symptoms of reduced functionality, and sometimes it's difficult to find ecological information for species. Sometimes this information can be lacking because of gaps in knowledge, so proxies can be used as well. So for the example of the Great Prairie Chicken, there are 3 identified functions, and the functionality was based on a proxy, which is observed density in a pre or non-impacted area, and it was determined as 1 bird per kilometer squared, because this is the density that was determined to result in stable populations. The fourth step is to determine state. The status should be assessed separately for each of the special units, and it can be absent, present, viable, or functional, and they correspond to the list to the red list assessment of the species in each of the special units, and the functionality should be determined as we just discussed. So what you would do is that per special unit, you would use the summary sheet from the red list criteria and determine the state in each of them, or you would follow the online questionnaire for the status calculator, which would guide you through the same questions as the summary sheet. So now that we have defined the range, the special units, and we know how to determine the recovery state in each of the units, you have the information that's necessary to calculate the green scores. The green scores are the base of the green status because they are used to calculate the conservation impact metrics. All the green scores are degrees of recovery defined in reference to the fully recovered state, and each corresponds to a conservation impact metric that's associated with different scenarios. So it's really important to realize that the first green score, which is the current green score, is the only one that's based on actual data. The other green scores, which are counterfactual, current, future without conservation, future with conservation, and long-term potential, are all based on hypothetical scenarios. So the first measure or first metric that we're going to discuss is the species recovery score. This one is based, it's equal to the current green score, and it's the most basic output of an assessment. A published green status can have only this green score, and it's a percentage that communicates how a species is doing in terms of how close or how far it's from being recovered. So we have a percentage that goes from 0, which is extinct in the wild, to 100, which is fully recovered or non-depleted. And so the recovery status of the species will fall within this range of percentage, and it will correspond to a category. This bird here is the lovely female of the greater prairie chicken. And for the species, what we have is a score of 50%, which corresponds to the category largely depleted. And this is due to the species being ecologically functional in 2 of the 6 special units, and 1 of the special units is absent. So in the range of from 0 to 100, the species is in the 50%. So it's important to also note that the green scores and the red category and the red list categories are not associated or linked together. So from the more favorable fully recovered species to the less favorable extinct in the wild category, they wouldn't necessarily correspond to least concern and also extinct in the wild. They are independent and they reflect different things. For instance, in the example, we have a nearly threatened species that's largely depleted, and the largely depleted, what is telling us is that it is absent it has lost a presence in part of its historical range, and it's not functional in some parts of it. So this is reflecting the story of the species again, and the current situation of the species in relation to the indigenous range. And now we're going to move on to the conservation metrics. And the first one is conservation legacy. And this is the difference between the species current green score and the green score in the absence of past conservation. So what we're doing is comparing the current green status with the status that would have been observed if there were no conservation actions in the past. So it predicts the trajectory that a species would have followed in the absence of conservation. For the greater prairie chicken, the species has a medium conservation legacy because without past conservation actions like breeding programs and translocation, the greater prairie chicken would have had a lower score, like 39% as opposed to 50%. Next is the conservation dependence metric, which compares the green score with the predicted green score in short term, using assuming ongoing conservation actions stop and no new ones are implemented. So what we're seeing is the expected change in the species status and the avoided declines. For the greater prairie chicken, it has a low conservation dependence because if all of the actions were to stop, it's expected that the species would lose functionality in one of the special units, and so the score would come down to 44% as opposed to 50%. The following metric is conservation gain. It compares the current green status and the predicted green status in the short term, considering all of the likely benefits of current and planned conservation. So what it's doing is that it's measuring the impact of ongoing and planned conservation, so the expected improvements in a 10-year framework. For the greater prairie chicken, the conservation gain is 0 because even with planned conservation, it's unlikely that the species will gain functionality in special units that are already functional in the 10-year time frame. And finally, the recovery potential, it's associated with a long term, and it compares current green status with the predicted green status in the long-term future, given sustained conservation and innovation. So this is within a 100-year time frame, and it is the aspirational aspect of the green score. So it's looking at all of the potential and plausible things that can be done for the species conservation, and given sustained and innovative conservation, what would happen to the species in 100 years. So it's looking at this potential for the greater prairie chicken. The recovery potential is low because it could achieve viability in only one additional spatial unit, because and the rest of because the range is too degraded to restore. So this is also giving us an idea of what we could expect in terms of recovery for the species. So this concludes all of the metrics that we look when we're doing an assessment. And I wanted to ask you if you have any questions and open a space for a discussion.
Perfect. Thank you, Salome. If you want to stop sharing your screen, and
Yeah.
then if people do have questions, then feel free to pop your cameras on so that we have faces to the questions. And yes, we've got sort of 15-20 minutes or so. So feel free to fire away if you have any thoughts.
I think I'll go first. In your experience, how much of these green status assessments are primarily like a literature review as opposed to having to go in and maybe do additional surveys with the people on the ground? How much can you get from after you do a red list assessment, basically take out that data and inform the green status? How much more work is it?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a lot of the data overlaps with what we need for a red list assessment. So something that we are actually really trying to encourage and to get specialist groups maybe to think about a little bit more is doing green status assessments alongside their red listing. Because obviously some of the information that Salome presented to you is different in a green status. So thinking about a bit more in depth about the Indigenous range and thinking about the spatial units and the functionality are elements that don't come into a red list. But a lot of the information when it comes to actually understanding the current status of the species and also thinking about what information we're going to use to inform those scenarios. So when we're thinking about the counterfactual current and the scenarios with and without conservation, we use data like population trends, sort of pre intervention trends. So for example, if we know that within a red list assessment there was a certain trend before an intervention took place, that can be really helpful for informing those scenarios. So a lot of the data will overlap. There are instances where we may have gaps in information, where it might be useful to have additional survey information, but I haven't had any experiences where we've really had like a complete pause on an assessment because we need more data. There's been instances where we've opted to hold back on completing and publishing the assessment because we know that there is updated data coming soon. So we've decided that actually we'd prefer to wait for that so we can put the most up-to-date information in. But for the most part, it will be based on information that's available. And particularly thinking about the kind of the earlier stages, so the defining a functional population through the Indigenous range, a lot of that can come from literature. And that's been really integral in Salome's work with us, because she's been able to do a lot of the kind of background legwork of drafting some of this background information based on the literature, which we then get feedback from species experts to make sure that what we've suggested is correct. And then also to really support us in those kind of more hypothetical scenarios, which is harder to get from the literature, and we need to know more about what's actively going on with the species.
Thank you very much. A little bit of a follow-up. When you do the green status assessment, in terms of like stability or like forward thinking, how much do you take into account other like social or economic pressures that might be in the pipeline or coming down the pipeline? Like if you know that there's a development nearby, or if someone is expected to, if like the ownership of a tract of forest or something is about to change, how does that factor in, or do you use that type of information?
Yeah, if we have that type of information, then we can use it. So thinking about the 10-year future scenarios, in the consideration of what conservation actions we would consider, we would think about ones that are planned and expected to go ahead in the near future. So similarly, if we had an instance where we know that there is a development and it's planned and we're expecting it to go ahead and impact our species in the near future, then we would include that in there. The one that's slightly different is when we're thinking about the 100-year long-term scenario. So the idea for that is that we want it to give us the maximum plausible level of recovery. So for that one, we wouldn't so much consider things like funding restraints or political constraints. We would just think if everything that's biologically possible for this species happened, then what would we expect to see in 100 years' time? So those kinds of other constraints tend to be a bit more relevant in the 10-year. But again, if we have the information, then we can include it in the justifications. Any other questions at all from anyone? Okay, maybe a very rapid question and answer. I do have a little bit of a question kind of back to the audience. So I know that we have got some people here who are kind of specialists with small mammals, and particularly we're going to sort of tap into your expertise for the Bahamian Hutia, but are there people who work on other species or taxonomic groups as well, just so I can get a bit of a feel for the kind of group that we've got?
Hello, my name is Melissa Kemp. I'm at the University of Texas at Austin, and my primary expertise is in reptiles. So working with a broad variety of reptiles, but.
Oh, excellent. I've done quite a few reptile assessments. I really enjoy reptile assessments. Amazing. And Michelle, you've got your hand up.
Hi, thank you. That was a really great intro and first part of this workshop. I'm an archaeologist, but I'm a zooarchaeologist by trade, meaning I'm really interested in human-animal interactions from a long-term perspective and leveraging these deep historical perspectives of animal biodiversity and human impacts to get us to, the kind of discussion that we're having today. And I was just going to say that my specialty is kind of across vertebrate classes. We're doing similar types of work like with the Hutia with some bird species. I also really enjoy marine vertebrate and invertebrates. So it is really fun to think about Hutia with this and additional potential applications. So thank you all so much for doing this.
Yeah, amazing. And thank you for joining. I think having something that can be quite a challenge in the assessments is thinking about the Indigenous range. Quite often we may be lacking in data and we may have to use inferences or be a little bit uncertain. So it's really interesting hearing from the sort of archaeological perspectives. And as you say, you think about archaeological perspectives in different taxa. So if you have any thoughts that might be helpful to individuals trying to think of Indigenous range or establish Indigenous range for different taxa, then we would love to hear from you. It's something that my colleague Molly Grace in the Green Status specialist group is working a lot on. I see your head nodding. Maybe you know her from the paleo group that she's in.
Yeah, no, they're a fun one they're a really fun group to follow.
Yeah, amazing. They're doing lots of good work, which will hopefully speed up the assessment process in the future and in terms of just helping guide people through what can be a bit of a challenging step sometimes. Amazing, thank you. And Ethan, I saw that you popped your camera on just now.
Yeah, hi. I'm a botanist, so I am in this discussion from a very different perspective. My involvement in this is that I've been actually studying the vegetation on the different islands that the Hutia are on here in the Bahamas. So kind of looking at what happened at Little Wax Key and that population and the vegetation there, and on Wardrick Wells and things like that. And actually got a chance to spend some time on East Plana Key and what that has been like to have a long-term population of Hutia on it and how that changed the vegetation.
Oh, amazing. That's really interesting. And also, we're always keen to introduce the green status to botanists because we are sadly lacking a little bit in plant assessments. And we're always keen to have more plant assessments.
So I do have a question, and I'll bring it up now, is the assessment doesn't include East Plana Key because of the reported involvement of leucaens moving the animals around and stuff like that. Given that, I'm not going to argue that point, but the population on Little Wax Key has collapsed, so that's not a viable population anymore. Likely is at this point in time gone. And the likelihood of the population on Wardrick Wells collapsing and ceasing to exist because it's such a small vegetation state and already seeing changes to the Hutia population there. If those two populations collapse, would East Plana Key, would Hutia then be considered extinct in the wild?
I will, for this one, I will defer to a combination of Salome and Ros because Salome has been working very much on this assessment, and Ros has helped with some of the more sort of technical aspects. So I will defer for the answers to that one.
I think the answer is yes. It would be considered extinct in the wild, yeah. From a red list, IUCN red list point of view, I'm not sure about the green status and how we're going to be looking at functional units. I think that's going to come up for discussion in a few minutes. So I don't actually know the answer to that bit.
In terms of, so thinking in terms of kind of red list and green status, within the green status, a lot of the kind of guidelines are very much based on the red list because the green status is a part of the red list. So things like the definitions of extinct in the wild would remain consistent. So yes, the spatial units are always, I've said the indigenous range is a challenge. The spatial units are also very often a challenge. And this was one that we had to think about quite a bit in terms of what would be appropriate to be included in the indigenous range. So yes, I think that will be one that we'll kind of come back to for a bit further discussion. If there are, I've got another question.
Hey, so I am mostly engaged in capacity building in the Bahamas and Caribbean. So my perspective on this whole thing is not necessarily from just the Hutia side, although I am on the relic group, but I also do a lot of plant-related work and marine science work. And so I'm very interested in seeing the overall structure of the green status assessment, how it fits into the red status, the red list assessments, and then also how we can develop more opportunities to just build up the cohort of people in country who can then do the assessments because there's already, thousands of species in the Bahamas and no 5 people will ever be able to do them all, right? So just trying to get that and looking at it from that side, but also place-based science and assessment. Like I understand that the red list and green list, they're global level assessments, but then some things don't work very conveniently in the Bahamas because of our archipelagic nations, state, and then the way politics or jurisdictions of conservation work inside our country. And so I guess I would like to know if we are going to talk about how these red list and green list assessments actually engage with different communities inside the different areas. Like, do you have like a checklist? Like, have you talked to the government officials that are protecting the space? Have you talked to the park or wildlife managers that protect the space? what about zoos and aquaria who might have like captive breeding programs? Like, what does that look like in this like conservation recovery system?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So kind of a couple of different lines to the question. So one thing you asked was sort of how it fits in with the red list. So I'll quickly show you an example of a published assessment, just to sort of illustrate that. So this is one of the recently published assessments for the Iberian lynx, and you can see that the green status sits very much within the red list assessment because it's all part of the same thing. And the idea is that we have this one area where we can gather lots of information. And so the information from the green status is quite different from what's in the red list, but the idea is that it's quite complementary and it helps to kind of tell the fuller story. So you can see that we've got the red list and the green status species recovery score. And then as we scroll through, the results are sort of interspersed. We've got, these are the results for those conservation impact metrics, which are based on those different scenarios. And you can see there's lots of additional information in there. And as you go through, again, there's all this kind of background information on the range. It's all in there on the website. And if you are interested in looking at green status assessments, they're not the easiest to just sort of find straightforward. But if you are on the red list and you go onto the advanced search, and then just scroll down to the bottom here and you can select green status, and all of the published green status assessments will come up. There isn't a huge number at the moment, and this is because we've only just got SIS for green status. So all of these older ones were uploaded through a very clunky HTML code method, but we've just done our first upload with SIS. So in the upcoming red list update, the number of green status assessments will about double, and then we'll continue to add more. So that is just a little bit about them and where they sit and how you can find them. In terms of other people who are involved, so we don't have set rules of, these kinds of people need to be involved. You need to have people from X, Y, and Z organizations. At the moment, we are largely doing assessments based on people's interests. So if someone is particularly interested in assessing a species, they'll come to us and we can give them support in doing that assessment, provide them with training materials and that sort of thing, and then help them through the process. We strongly recommend assessments be done collaboratively. So that will often include non-governmental organizations and governmental organizations, national parks. These are the kinds of groups of people that commonly get brought in. It's really beneficial if people have the ability to bring in the input from Indigenous people. That's sometimes, I think that's a harder one to manage, just in terms of having the people don't always have the relationships that they need to be able to get that input, but it's amazing if they can. And it's something that we would like to see more of. And they also then go through a reviewing process. So they'll be reviewed by someone within the IUCN. And we ask the specialist groups to support us in identifying appropriate species assessment reviewers. So additional species experts who can contribute, with the idea of having kind of as many different inputs and perspectives, particularly when we're thinking about those different scenarios, which could be a little subjective. So it's really beneficial to have multiple inputs. And then the final thing I was going to say, and this is a little bit in response for the question from Dill in the chat, or the comment from Dill, is that we do have online training as well. I'll pop a link to that in the chat in a little bit. But there is a free online training session if you're interested in doing assessments. So in general, if people aren't necessarily sort of an expert in the species, it would be beneficial that we could help them work with the specialist group. If there's a specialist group who would like support in doing sort of the initial drafting, to then work with them. But yes, the online training is a really good place to start. So I'll put a link to that, and that's free. It's, I think, 8 to 10 modules. Very similar to the red list training. It's sort of based on the same thing. Perfect. So if there aren't any more questions, I think this actually perfectly brings us up to the timing that I was aiming for, to just run through my presentation, which is only quite short, but just a couple of questions that come up quite commonly, and maybe concerns from assessors, and some of the benefits of doing green status assessments. So we'll run through that, and then we'll get into it a bit more with the Hutia assessment, and we can have a bit more of a discussion about that. And also for people who are maybe not so sort of honed in on that species, but you'll still get to see what goes into the process, and the kind of the way we work through it. I should just quickly share my screen. Okay, perfect. So yes, as I said, these are just a few of the potential challenges and some of the benefits. So I have touched on this already a little bit, but a big question that we have is, do we have enough data? And that is something that people do sometimes worry about, that maybe they don't have the most up-to-date data, or they only have trend data or that kind of thing. And something that is really helpful for the green status in terms of this is those quite broad groupings that we assign. So Salome mentioned that when we go through, we assign the different states, and they fall into 4 categories of absent, present, viable, and functional. And they're quite broad, and they're guided by the red list. So if a species is absent, we know it's completely lost from the spatial unit. If it's present, it's in the spatial unit, but it is threatened. So it falls within one of the red list categories, or it may be near threatened, but with a continuing decline. We have viable populations, which would be considered either least concern or near threatened and without a continuing decline. And then a functional population. So it's viable, but it's also performing the ecological functions. And this is where that sort of thinking about the functionality threshold for the species comes in. So at what kind of population densities and demographics will we need to see a functional population? And so because we do put it into these sort of quite broad categories, having population data, of course, is really valuable. Something else that we can, of course, include is the temporal nature of it. It may be that the population data is a couple of years old. We would just specify that and specify when it's from. And sometimes it's necessary for us to sort of make inferences. So we may know that the population, we saw a certain trend in a certain year, and we have evidence to suggest that that trend's continued. So we would infer kind of that the population is lower than it was. But that's enough to be able to put it into this sort of present category, because we know that it is declining. So having fairly coarse data is generally still suitable. Trend data, as I said, is very helpful. It is really important that we have information on conservation actions, both past ones, because they're really crucial for thinking about the counterfactuals, but also ongoing and planned conservation actions. And this was that really important point that was made about the importance of including other people. So having whether it's government or non-government organisations who are participating in the conservation actions, having involvement or at least some links with them to make sure that we have this information. And then another thing that's important to add is that we do incorporate uncertainty. We know that, and we understand that there are going to be some, particularly when we're thinking about the scenarios in these hypothetical situations where we're not necessarily going to know. So we capture this by including the most likely scenario. So what do we think is the most likely thing that we're going to see in this example in 10 years without continued conservation? But then we also have an upper bound, which reflects kind of the best case scenario, and a lower bound to reflect the worst case scenario. And so you can see for this first example, we consider the most likely outcome is that the species would remain present within 10 years with no conservation. But, you know, if the trends are kind of worse than we expect, then it could be absent. And then in this second spatial unit, we have a slightly different scenario where the population started out smaller. So it's a less robust population. So we would expect that it probably would be absent in 10 years with no conservation. But the best case scenario is we may have a small population hanging on, so they may be present. So we're able to capture this uncertainty. How do we define a functional population? That can be really challenging. In the kind of an ideal scenario, we may have these lovely interactions. So a great example of this is sea otters. So if we have a functional population of sea otters, they keep down the number of sea urchins. As a result, the sea urchins are not feeding too much on the kelp, and then we see a healthy kelp forest. So we sometimes have these lovely, clear indications. So, you know, if we're seeing a degradation in one thing, we know it's because we don't have a functional population. This isn't that common. A lot of the time, we don't have these very clear cascades. But again, that's not a problem. There's lots of alternatives we can use. So Salome mentioned that we can use proxies. So thinking about things like the pre-impact data. So if we do have information on what the population density and the population structures looked like before human impacts on a population, we can think about that. If we have data on, for example, the carrying capacity of a spatial unit, then that could be really helpful. We could also use proxy species. So maybe we don't know enough about the functionality of the Bahamian Hutia, but perhaps there is another Hutia species that inhabits very similar ecosystems, we would expect to have similar functions and has been less impacted, then we maybe could use that as an alternative example. So there are just a couple of other ways that we can think about the functionality. And then finally, another question that we do get quite a lot is if there is a recovery ceiling. And so unfortunately, in just the state of the world that we live in today, it is not that common for species to get to 100% recovery. And we don't really expect them to. So it's not a case of we should be aiming for 100% recovery in all of the species that we assess. What we're trying to answer with this is, what is the maximum plausible level of recovery that we could achieve? And if that is only 50%, because huge amounts of the indigenous range of the species has just been completely lost or completely converted, then that's not a problem. It's just, it helps us to understand that, and it helps us to give us more sort of reasonable targets. So sometimes people do kind of see it as a concern, but it is just the way of the world, and this is one way that we can kind of understand and communicate that. So for a couple of the benefits of the green status, so it's a really great aid for communicating conservation success. One example of this that I like to use is the mountain chicken, which was assessed as critically endangered in 2004. And this is a species that Durrell's worked with for a long time. And we've done huge amounts of work. So there's been lots of work with this species. So looking at disease, doing captive breeding, translocations, huge numbers of interventions. Over the space of 20 years, it's gone from critically endangered to critically endangered. So from an outward perspective, you may say, well, we've been doing all this conservation. It's been 20 years and nothing's changed. What was the point? Or, you know, what have you achieved? And that's where the conservation legacy is, I think, a really powerful metric, because it helps us to tell that sort of untold story of, yes, we haven't changed this species from critically endangered, but in the absence of any conservation, the most likely scenario is that this species would have gone extinct. And so that gives us a very high conservation legacy and helps us to illustrate the importance that conservation has had. And then similarly, it helps us to highlight the need for continued conservation. So downlisting of a species to a lower red list threat category is a really great indication of conservation success. So as kind of with the mountain chicken example, it can take a very long time to happen. But when it does happen, it's a great indication that conservation's been working. But it can also have some sort of slightly more negative effects. So there's a risk that the need for continued conservation might be underappreciated. And a prime example of this is the downlisting of the giant panda. So it's great that it was downlisted from endangered to vulnerable, but it caused quite a lot of discussions and concerns from people that we don't necessarily want to say it's vulnerable because it's an endangered species. Are we still going to have enough support to work on it? And that's not an uncommon concern, because often funders sort of look at it's a critically endangered species and more likely to fund it. And so it is a concern of, if we downlist our species, will the resources we need to continue our work, will they dry up? And this is where that conservation dependence legacy can be a really important way of communicating this. So again, using that mountain chicken example, This is looking at the 10-year future scenario. And so if we were to stop everything we were doing for this species, the most likely scenario is that it would be extinct within 10 years. So in just a decade, all of those 20 years of work would likely be lost. And so again, this is a great way for communicating that need for continued support. Even if we are downlisting species, if we want that to be maintained and supported, then we need continued support to be able to keep the actions that we're doing going. So that was just kind of a quick summary of some of the concerns that sometimes get raised and some of the benefits of doing a green status assessment. So yes, that kind of brings to an end the presentation section. And now, unless anyone has any quick questions beforehand, I'm going to hand over to Salome to go through the Hutia assessment. So we do, just to give you a bit of background again, we do all of the assessments at the moment using an online workbook. So it's like an Excel spreadsheet where we go through and answer all of the specific questions to build up this description of what a fully recovered species looks like, and then going through and actually assessing the different states. So Salome is going to go through with you what she's done so far and get your input. And Ancilleno, you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask about the conservation legacy and conservation dependency issues. Excuse me. If it's impossible for a species to survive, like have you come across that in the past? Is there like some designation where you're like, there's no way that this is going to survive in its in the spatial units, and it has to be like done through ex situ conservation or something like that? And have you ever had a situation where something is extinct in the wild and you have to like put that into a green list or red list assessment, and then after 5 years of like really intense work, they get to put 2 of them back inside the forest or something, and now you go from absent to actually having something?
Yes, so that's a really good point that you mentioned about if you have to look basically essentially to new sites because they're not going to persist in their current sites. So one of the questions that we have when we're thinking about the range of the species is there any expected additional range? And that's something that will be covered for this species as well. So are there any areas outside of the indigenous range which are expected to become inhabited by the species within the next 100 years? And that may be as a result of climate change, where we're seeing population ranges shifting as a result of climate change, or it may be as a result of translocation. So for example, a species which cannot or is very unlikely to survive within its indigenous range, so there's plans to translocate it to somewhere new, that would be incorporated in that expected additional range. Similarly, if you've got an example where you have a species that you maybe want to introduce elsewhere as an ecological replacement for an extinct in the wild species, that would also come into that expected additional range. And then in terms of species going from extinct in the wild to not, yes, but just like with the red list, if you have instances where a species has gone extinct in the wild, but then there's been some really successful conservation interventions, then they'd be reassessed and following that kind of new assessment. So it would probably be fairly likely that they would, in that first instance, come in at critically depleted unless we're able to really have them thriving straight away. And again, that would give us a very high conservation legacy, because the only reason that this species is there in the wild is as a result of conservation. And that does remind me sort of a quick additional point is that the populations assessed within the green status, we only assess wild populations. So we don't include captive individuals. So just like with the red list, a population has to meet the criteria of the red list to be considered wild to be included in the assessment. So yeah, when we get sort of a re-established population, it has to have met those criteria to be considered wild again. Perfect. So I think we are bang on time, I believe, for Salome to start working through the workbook. So if you want to share your screen, hopefully there was some questions sent around before. Well, there were examples of what Salome is suggesting. So you may have had a chance to already read those. But if not, then we'll kind of have a bit of time to sort of read through what's on the screen. You might need to zoom in on it a little bit, Salome. But yes, I shall hand over to you to kind of, if you want to maybe zoom out a little bit and just kind of show people the stages through the workbook, and then we'll go into the individual sections.
Okay, so the workbook is divided into different tabs that kind of address different important or key aspects of the assessment. So in the first tab, we have to determine the range. So the first question is try to assess or determine the benchmark year, which is the year that humans became a major factor influencing the species distribution. Then we would try to determine the range by this year. And then we have to continue to think about the range, and try to think about areas that are currently occupied by the species, but were not occupied by the benchmark year. So I think that in this instance we would also include range expansions and additional spatial units, like Becca mentioned, where populations were released. And also we would have to justify everything, how we determine the benchmark year, and talk about expected additional range, areas that are outside this additional range but are expected to become occupied by the species. This can be done with species distribution models, and this is basically the first bit of the assessment. So what we propose is that I will give you a little bit of time to go through what I proposed, and just as an introduction, can you read, or should I zoom in a little bit more? Becca.
I can read it okay, as long as other people can. So these are the what Salome sort of briefly introduced in the presentation of some of the kind of general thinking behind it. But yeah, if you just want to take a couple of minutes to just have a little read through, maybe if you could zoom in a little bit more by the sounds of it. It will depend on kind of what other people have going on their screens. So yeah, just a chance to have a quick read through, and if there is anything that you think is incorrect or shouldn't be in there, or just needs slightly tweaking, then this is a great opportunity to raise that. And also in terms of that, feel free to just sort of chime in as and when, because obviously we don't want to just sort of sit and leave everyone reading and not know when they finish. So if you have thoughts or points, then yeah, just chime in and we'll move on in a couple of minutes.
I'm wondering if the different spatial units would have different histories in this type of assessment, like the Hutia introductions to the islands that they were introduced to after we like refound or rediscovered them. Would they then be considered different spatial units? Whereas the Lucayans or the native peoples may not have even had them on those islands because the islands were too small, but then we moved them there for conservation purposes. Excuse me. So
yeah, so I think
how does that represent?
It's probably quite helpful to make that distinction. One quick thing I'll say is just about the benchmark year, and then I'll hand over to Salome to make that distinction. For the benchmark year, particularly where we have more wide-ranging species, it's probably not as relevant to this one. But if you have a very wide-ranging species where the time when human intervention was different across the range, you would go back to the earliest point. So if in one part of the range, human intervention began in 1550 and elsewhere it began in 1600, you default back to the earliest one. So that's just a little side note. And then Salome, I'll let you explain about the different islands.
Yeah, so with the Hutia, this one was a really great opportunity to talk about human impact in the green status assessment, because for this species specifically, most of the kind of interventions that were very important for the species biogeography was influenced by these people that were present before the benchmark year. So at least from what I understand, there were movements associated with the species that were cultural for the Lucayans, and they were moving the species around as a food source. And so they were the presence of the species outside of what was determined as their probable like island of origin was not natural, was not a natural dispersion, and was associated by the activity of the Lucayans. So from our kind of discussions and from the guidelines that are presented by the green status, the indigenous range would be where the species was present, that has the species. Wait, so the indigenous range would be the area where the species was before the Lucayans started moving the species around, and by the 1500s, it would be it wouldn't include the areas where the species was translocated to, because also they were not translocated for conservation reasons. So it's really important to consider the distinction of the reason why they were moved around and the benchmark year, and also if they were present there in a specific island because they were moved for subsistence. I don't know if I'm making myself clear. This was quite an important point of discussion for us, because I believe it was the first time that we came across a species that had such a kind of ancestral effect that was driven by people, and also extinction that was related to people as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary of it. And yeah, it's just a good opportunity to see if anyone has any concerns about having the 1500 as benchmark year, and the way that we've defined it, that if they were taken to an island for the purpose of sort of farming and or for any other cultural reasons rather than for conservation introductions, that we wouldn't include them in the indigenous range, whereas those more recent reintroductions are included because they were put there for translocation purposes. Again, also that's partly us being consistent with the red list. So if anyone has any thoughts or comments that they would like to add or raise about that, or if everyone's fairly happy with what we've suggested for that.
Yeah, and before that, I just want to refer back to the question that someone asked about the newer populations. So the Isplana one wouldn't be considered a part of the indigenous range, but Little Wags and Werdrick case would, because those are part of an island that is part of the Great Bahamian Bank, which was the identified indigenous range. So in summary, what we proposed is that by the 1500 or before the 1500, we know that before this time the Hutia populations were present in other islands outside of the Great Bahamian Bank, but because of the movement that was driven by the Lucayans. So we know that people were affecting the species distribution and abundance before this year, but since this is the cutoff year, this is the year that we have defined as the benchmark year.
Perfect. I think, I mean, it seems like no one's raised any concerns from that. So, oh,
Sorry,
Fallon, you have something to say?
Yeah, sorry, Fallon Cartwright with the Bahamas National Trust, Director of Science and Policy. I understand the rationale and being informed by the red list and the guidelines. It's just it does seem like a little bit of mental jujitsu and a bit illogical from a practical conservation standpoint. Just giving the timescales that we're talking about and just the reality on the ground. So we can go through these exercises, but it does raise a concern for me about how will we use these and communicate about this in a way that doesn't create confusion for folks who are not, you know, in the weeds with these assessments. And
Yeah,
for those
so
that aren't aware, I mean, the Bahamas National Trust is the National Park Management Authority. So the real world implications for how we communicate and implement conservation action for this species, I think for technical folks, we will grasp it, but it does seem like a bit of a kind of, yeah, it's a challenge for sure. And I see Michelle has her hand up.
yeah, Michelle, did you want to add to that before I attempt to answer?
Yeah, I do. I just have a quick question, and Fallon, thank you for bringing up that excellent question, because I was sort of wondering when this was done, maybe I'm misunderstanding. Did this assessment that's being presented include any of our Bahamian partners and on the ground leaders?
Oh, so yeah, so that's basically the point of what we're doing now. So one thing, just to answer that question first, one thing that has been a major sticking point and kind of barrier to us getting more green status assessments done is purely capacity. We've got interest from people to do it, but they don't have the time to do it. Which is where we've been working with people like Salome, who's been doing an internship with the Small Mammal Specialist Group. And so the idea is that she uses literature, so it's just based on the literature, to draft these initial ideas and to help kind of make the backbone of the assessment. And then this stage that we're at now is that crucial part where we need the input from people on the ground, people who are working with the species, people who are in the Bahamas, and that's why this is initially kind of sense checking the background information that we're proposing, and then also feeding into all of the kind of next steps of the assessment, which are understanding the conservation interventions that are taking place. So at the moment there hasn't been input, but that's kind of the way that we're doing it to try and reduce the ask of what we're asking for people who are already very busy, is that we can do some of the legwork in the background and then get your input, and it just kind of speeds up those initial steps. So that's the purpose of this and where we're at in terms of having people involved. And this is where Ros has been really helpful as the part of the Small Mammal Specialist Group's role in kind of bringing together the experts, because obviously myself in a green status place, I don't necessarily know the relevant experts, but as part of the specialist group, Ros is able to help put us in touch with relevant people. And then just quickly before we go on to Ancilleno's question, just to come back to your question, Fallon, about the kind of sort of the nitty gritty of it. And it is quite a big piece of work that we do. And again, this is why we want to sort of support from the green status side as much as we can. The idea is that the results from it can complement what's in the red list, and so helping to give us an understanding of how close a species is to being fully recovered, and that's why we have to think about this kind of background benchmark year. But it also helps with seeing the impact that conservation has had, so it can be really nice for communicating, you know, these actions that we've done have had this impact. It can be used to help inform planning. It's not what it's designed for, but it can be kind of helpful in thinking about that of, you know, when we're thinking about the future scenarios, if we were to do these things, what kind of change could we hope to see? So that it can be useful for that as well. I'm not sure if that fully answers your question, or if there was anything else.
So, oh, and just to add context, for the red listing, I was out of office for 3 months this year. So I haven't caught up everything, but I know we have had conversations, and there has been support for doing the red list assessment, and Lino, maybe you're raising your hand to comment on that. So we have had this conversation with Roz and others, so I'm not sure of the status. I think was that finalized when I was out?
Yes, it was. It's going to be due out on the 28th of October as part of the batch update of red list assessments.
Okay.
Yeah, and that red list assessment was something that Salome has been able to use to inform some of this background information.
Right. So certainly these need to align. And Lino, maybe you can add in, yeah.
Yeah, so I just wanted to point out that this whole workshop that we're doing right now is really a part of that capacity building. And in our discussions, we were acknowledging that in country, we don't have enough professionals who really understand the full value of the red list and green status assessments. And so we wanted to provide this platform for us to see the work and kind of experience it, at least at the first level. And then also to provide a permanent resource that other conservation professionals in the Bahamas can use as a jumping off point, so that we can then do assessments like this. This is, you know, the first of probably a significant amount of interactions between us. Many of the people who are on this call have contributed to Hutia assessments in the past and other Hutia work, and we're doing a lot of work to just include more local perspective. And that's really what Science and Perspective is about, actually. So yes, we do have more involvement, and we're looking to use these avenues to increase involvement in developing these assessments. And so it's just sometimes it does look kind of daunting to see all of those, the copious amounts of papers to respond to and stuff like that. So thank you, Michelle, for that question. And thank you, everyone who contributed answers to kind of put it into perspective for what we're doing. But we went through the red list assessment, I think for the last 2 years, and now it's going through. And so now getting this green status assessment is another step. But I think after this, it'll be a lot quicker for us to get other plant assessments for Dr. Freed, or for all the other species that the BNT and the DMR and Ministry of Environment are taking care of as well. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much. And yeah, it's something that we, within the Green Status team, we're really keen to have more people involved in assessment. So there's myself and then my colleague in the Red List unit, who I can share her contact details with, can provide support if people do want to do assessments, to kind of help, you know, get you started and that sort of thing. So I think in terms of working through this one, it might be, so we've got kind of the benchmark, and also something else I will add is these workbooks are all kind of they're actively, we're working on them kind of. Salome, the way that the process will go is once she gets input from additional species experts, it's, you know, it's a very much a preliminary work, so she'll go in and make changes necessary. So with that in mind, it's a document that can be shared around between people who would like to contribute as an assessor. Then we'll share this around afterwards as well for continued feedback. I think in terms of kind of making progress today, I think it would be really helpful to make sure, well, to get a good discussion on the spatial units, because again, this was something that had quite a lot of discussion. So obviously I know, so Salome, you've got in there the kind of the description of the historic range, but I wonder if it might be easier to kind of go back to that map that you had and explain, you already gave a bit of an explanation, but explain the historical range and the spatial units, how they've been decided, and then just see if anyone has any feedback or thoughts on if there's any areas that we think maybe have been missed or should have been incorporated and haven't, or the other way around, just to make sure we've had people's input on that. And as well, obviously, if we're sharing it around after, if you think of something afterwards, then feel free to kind of respond after as well.
Yeah, so when I was proposing the indigenous range, we like Becca mentioned, I was digging through papers and relevant information associated with the Hutia, and what I found was that its origin or its indigenous range was determined in the Great Bahamian Bank, and so I think that it's important to also acknowledge that the benchmark here it's really valuable because there and we have come across this before. There are some species that their distribution and their abundance was kind of impacted before this year, but it's important to have like a cutoff because otherwise we would be considering impacts from like diverse moments in time. So and with this particular species, acknowledging that the Lucayans were impacting the species before this benchmark year, it's really important to then build upon that and consider where was the species by this benchmark year. And so for me, a really big question that I had was that we know that the species was moved around, and so the origin was the Great Bahamian Bank by the 1500s. Was it in this island still, or potentially it was already extinct? And so the ideal, and one of the things that I wanted to discuss today is to try to kind of decide where was the species but the benchmark year, considering the fossils and considering a Lucayan movement. And I don't know if maybe we can have a little bit of a discussion this based on your knowledge of the species and of the presence in the islands.
It might be helpful now, as well as the map, just to maybe show the list of the spatial units you're proposing, because that will indicate the islands quite clearly, won't it?
Yeah. So the ones that I proposed were the ones that I identified as belonging to the Great Bahamian Bank, and including Great Exuma, because in this island there's populations like the little wax or on Wardrick Welke. So these are the ones that I identified, but we wanted to check in with you if you, based on your knowledge, agree that this would be the range by the benchmark year and also correct special units for the species.
Hey, Salome. For me, I think putting Great Exuma there, or the Exuma is actually an archipelago within our archipelago. And like we mentioned earlier, the Hutia wouldn't swim between those islands really. And so those keys, I think, would need to be described specifically as opposed to putting it in the Exuma group. And so under the name of the spatial unit, you would have to explicitly say Little Wax Key or Wardrick Wells Key. And because they have very distinct spatial boundaries that the Hutia cannot move between. with regards to Andros, New Providence, Eleuthera, and Long Island, although those islands sit on the Great Bahama Bank, I'm wondering if in the historical records it was just mentioned that they were on the Great Bahama Bank, or did they explicitly state those islands?
Right. So, yes, that's basically also one of my questions. It is mentioned kind of in a more general sense, and actually, I'm gonna. So according to bone dating, the species was present in Eleuthera by the benchmark years, but bones from New Providence, Long Island, and Andros. So there is a bone presence, but they were not successfully dated. So it's possible that the species was there by the benchmark year, but also not because the bones were not successfully dated. So it's more like a discussion on the potential likelihood of the species being there by the benchmark year. That kind of goes escapes my background.
Okay,
Michelle,
that
you
sounds reasonable to me then to include those islands because you do have presence, but just not the year. But I would adjust the exuma locations to be more explicit about the keys within the exuma chain.
Okay.
Michelle, you have your hand up as well.
Yeah, I was gonna say that one of the places to look for some of this, and I'm trying to pull it up right now. Salome, when you're working on stuff like this, often the supplemental material that we have that are associated with these papers will have like site-specific data for the specimens and the specimen numbers, and if we don't have specimen numbers, we have records that you can go back to, at like a given source location, like in the Florida Museum for some of these, to find out if there is kind of more information. And also what I was going in terms of like specific sites, and this is kind of to Lino and Fallon's point that even on, some of these larger islands in the Bahamas, you can, from the north to the south, whether it's on, one side of the island or another, there can be some nuances that may matter from a green status perspective, maybe. And the last thing I was going to say real quick to some of this is, I can't remember if we said it in this paper or not, or if we've said it in talks, which you, of course, would never be responsible for. With some of these sites that did not date, it's probably because the preservation wasn't so good because they are older. They are from paleontological contexts that have other taxa that have not been recorded, much during the human history of the region. So if that helps, those little kind of devil in the detail kind of things to maybe help suss out some of these questions. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that when I was doing the background research, I tried to look into this as well, like going through the supplemental material, and I didn't find information that at least to my knowledge was conclusive enough to kind of determine what we're trying to respond.
Okay.
To answer, sorry, that's it. Yeah, to answer.
I think it's a very good point that you made about the separation of the two keys. I think that's a really good one because islands can be a really helpful one when it comes to spatial units. Michelle, you mentioned that there's maybe some variety in where they're found within the islands. So one thing to consider when we're thinking about the spatial units is we don't want to sort of over divide them. And because we are looking at quite small islands already, it makes sense to have it as kind of one island. And then something that we do think about when we're assigning the state is historically where would they have been found in that spatial unit, and it's not necessarily assumed that they would have been found universally across the whole island. If we have data to map that to indicate that maybe there's sort of habitat types where they would have been more likely to be found, then that's great, and we can include that information. And then when we're thinking about if they're still present or if they're viable, if they're functional within that area, then we would consider kind of, are they sort of uniformly found across where they would historically have been found? Are they just found in little pockets? So we can think about that more. But we do want to be a little bit overcautious of over dividing the spatial units, which has certainly been done in kind of some of the earlier assessments where we were a bit less, well, we were still working out how to divide spatial units. There was a lot of over division that happened before, so we're a bit cautious of that now.
So in response to that, then the great exuma would still have to change because that speaks specifically to great exuma.
Oh yes, yes. Yeah, I agree with that.
So
This
it would
was
have
more
to,
just
would have to say like the exuma keys, or right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and this kind of leads me to a follow-up question, and is that we know of the species presence there because there's like records, but if we were to think about the whole keys, so maybe it's not likely that beyond those two that are like currently known, if in another key it was present.
What do you mean? Sorry, in the
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking that that since it's a so Ancilleno mentioned it's a archipelago within the archipelago, right? So
yeah.
in maybe in other keys it might have been present. And
Right.
so if we only
Sorry, I do think that that's one of the important reasons for having an expert like Ethan Freed here, right? Some of those islands, because of the plants that are on those islands, it seems that they would have developed differently if there was historical Hutia presence there. And that might be it might be pushing the data or grasping, but because of the way those islands are distributed, it's unlikely that Hutia would have just randomly went to islands, and then the ones that they were on that we have evidence from, um, they're so specific and they're so small that I think that's important to be very particular with that. And I also look at the future use of whatever we publish. And I wouldn't want someone in the next 10 or 15 years to look back at our assessment and quote us as saying that the Hutia were present in the exuma chain, as opposed to saying that the Hutia were present on these three keys, because that also may change our understanding of our conservation legacy, like we're talking about right now, or it might change our understanding of the recovery or loss of the species as well. And so it, particularly in the Bahamas, I think that's very important to note that with our geography and our geology.
okay.
Brilliant, thank
So
you. And just very quickly, sorry, before we go on to Michelle's question, you mentioned about the use of having people who know like expertise on the plants, and that you said that maybe that's kind of sort of clutching a little bit, but it's something that we very much do use. So if we are lacking data, then we can use inference based on habitat types. And so if there, if we have evidence from an island where we know there wasn't Hutias versus one where we know there was, and the very, very different vegetation, then that can be an indication. If we have some of these islands where we're maybe a little bit more unsure, we could use that as an indicator. That's something that we could use if it was appropriate for this assessment.
Right. I think Dr. Freed actually has historical data of the plants on the islands, and then he has data of the change in vegetation on those islands after Hutia introduction. So I think using that information would be a really great way to infer what an island would look like if Hutia were on there before, or if it evolved without Hutia at all.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. If it would be possible to share that information, or if you've got some papers you can point us to where that is, then that would be really helpful. Michelle, you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you. And I'm learning a lot. I really appreciate everyone's time and knowledge and patience here. So I think my question might be more for Dr. Davis and Director Cartwright at BNT with Science and Policy, part of the organization. So I have a question. So I get the logic with the exumas, and I'm down with that. What do we do in a scenario, maybe with Abaco, for example, where we've done some surveys on some of the tinier little keys that are around Abaco, and finding Hutia there, where, you know, we find it maybe on the northern part of Abaco, like the larger island, and then say off to sort of the south or southeast part, and the kind of the little like maze of keys around there, we find some. Would that spatial specificity matter? I mean, I feel like the answer is yes here. Like, or would we just say no present on Abaco, because there's still quite a bit of biogeographic variability just even up there. Does that make sense?
I think the question makes a lot of sense, Michelle. I think when we're talking about IUCN red list and green status assessments, because they are very conservation related, I think the spatial distribution and the cohesion between sites is very important. And in terms of Abaco and Abaco's keys, those would form distinct conservation units. And so maybe that's something that I could pass the buck on to Salome again. Like when you're talking about spatial units, I see in North America, you might have a river or a mountain range that might create a boundary for certain species. For us, we have an ocean that separates our islands, right? And so what are you using to delineate spatial units in other areas that we could have as justifications? Because in my mind, I was thinking if the species cannot cross it by itself without human help, then that is a very easy to make spatial limitation. I think it might cause more work for us, but I'd rather us be as accurate as possible so that we're not misquoted in the future, or we don't have to have this same discussion again and again with every Bahamian conservationist that we work with.
Yeah, well, and Becca, feel free to chime in at any moment. I think that for delineating the special units, it's a matter of case by case, and that's why it's like defined as different, or it can be based in different things. So for instance, you can do subpopulations or genetic groups or evolutionary units. So but you can also use kind of conservation management units. So for me, what I think about when you're discussing this is that even though, I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just saying that even though perhaps there's no like natural dispersion within very close keys, maybe that can be managed as one in terms of conservation management and conservation decisions, conservation practice. I don't know, Becca, what you might consider with this.
Yeah, so I think you've pretty much covered it, that it is very case by case. And you were pretty on point when you said about, you know, if a species can't move without humans moving them, then that's a good justification for a spatial unit. So we do use islands quite a lot. One important thing to bear in mind is that spatial units, when we're defining them, they don't necessarily all need to be absolutely equal in size, but they need to be of equivalent importance in terms of conservation. So that's something to think about if you know, you can't have one. For example, an example I always go back to is Mauritius, because I do a lot of work on assessments there. So we would not have mainland Mauritius as one spatial unit and then the tiny offshore islets as different spatial units, because the weighting is very, very different of this one much larger island compared to the really small ones. So where we have a situation like that, we'd need to break down the much bigger island. With the Bahamian archipelago, I think that's not such a problem. I mean, particularly for the area that we're looking at, they're all very small islands. In terms of where we've got sort of tiny offshore islets, another thing to bear in mind is that each spatial unit should have the capacity to support a viable population. So again, when thinking about the red list definitions of a viable population, is that it wouldn't meet any of the threat categories. So it would need to be able to hold a population of at least 1,000 mature individuals. So we do sometimes get instances where a spatial unit is too small to hold a viable population. So for that reason, we might have to join two together. Ros, I can see you've got something to add.
Just that does raise an interesting question, because obviously Ethan mentioned quite near the start of the workshop that some of the islands that have been used to maroon the species on in the 70s and 80s were probably too small really to hold what we consider to be viable populations. For example, Little Wax Cay is a teeny tiny island. And I'd also say with the spatial units, when you were saying they needed to be roughly the same, Andros is a comparatively much bigger island than, say, East Plana Cay. Sorry, that's not in this one, is it? Sorry. Say Waldrick Wells. The scale is quite different.
Yeah, so they don't. It's kind of slightly an awkward one to communicate, because they don't necessarily have to be sort of actually equivalent in size. So, but they need to be equivalent in conservation importance. So thinking for the Mauritius example, we divide up mainland Mauritius into multiple spatial units, but those spatial units are still considerably larger than the offshore islands. But they, when you think about the conservation importance of them, they are, because the invasive species on the mainland are so much harder to control than the invasive species on the offshore islands. Even though the islands are much smaller, they have more conservation value than the mainland, where we can't control the invasive. So it's there's kind of nuances to how we can think about it. So I don't know if that's the case here in terms of kind of the different threats on Andros compared to the Cays ones. So that's something to consider in terms of the sizes of them. In terms of being able to support a viable population, that may be a reason for having to lump some islands together. And obviously that's not ideal in terms of talking about the sort of free movement between them. But if one of the other things that Salome mentioned is you can think about in terms of management units. So if these islands were kind of for the same reason they were used to maroon the species is managed the same on them, we could use that as have that as a reasoning for kind of keeping them together. I don't know if anyone has any kind of strong thoughts on that.
I think this is going to require further discussion, a post-workshop. We are coming up to 1 o'clock now, but I do think that this is something where we involve the practitioners at the Bahamas National Trust to kind of like think about how that will be delineated. And then in terms of importance, I would say the places where bones were found are less important to me than the places where Hutia are still alive. And so, so in that importance balance, conservation importance balance, although Andros is way bigger, it's probably less important right now.
And that was
Okay,
going to be one of my questions as well, where you have the archaeological information. Do we have estimates or can we infer population size in those areas, or is it simply a presence absence? And I do agree, I guess, one of my concern for lumping exuma is, or obviously it needs to align with the guidelines and make sense from the perspective of the listing. So we can't just make up our own rules, but I do see importance for those keys where the species has existed recently or is existing now.
One thing actually that is an important thing to bear in mind in terms of lumping and separating those is that we do have a small population caveat within the green status, whereby there are some populations, I mean, these don't fully apply to this, but there are some populations which are naturally small. So obviously they're not natural populations because we've put them there, but they would be naturally small just purely because of the size of the island. So as long as certain criteria are met, then we can consider them a naturally small population. And we have, so one of the things that Salome mentioned in her presentation, and if you kind of going forward as we start working together in the workbook, there is actually a link to this, but there's what we call the state calculator, which my colleague Molly put together. So you literally go through to consider your spatial units and go through and answer specific questions about that spatial unit. And then at the end, and it essentially takes you through a flowchart of questions that you would be asked in a red list assessment. And at the end, it will tell you whether it basically, if it can fulfill that small population caveat. So that's something that we can check, or we can kind of, work with you to see if it would fit that caveat, in which case it would make sense to separate them. And equally, obviously, you said about going back and speaking to other colleagues in the Bahamas National Trust. We can also speak to our other colleagues in the Red List unit who have got, between us, we've got a very large wealth of experience of green status assessments. And so they might have some useful inputs as well. So I think it makes sense to have a little bit more of a think about whether they should be split or combined. Michelle?
Sorry, when you're done, I was just going to address Fallon's question about population size.
Yes, that would be great.
From a past perspective. So here's it's actually, I think, pretty exciting and pretty cool, Fallon, is from both paleontological or non-cultural contexts and archaeological contexts, we have thousands upon thousands upon thousands of archaeological specimens and paleontological specimens yet to be totally quantified. There were oodles from many of these sites. We can also work toward having an understanding of population size, sort of from a genetic perspective, by starting to hone in on really kind of hash out the phylogenetic relationships across the, and by say populations, I'm going to say the archaeological and paleontological assemblages we have from across the Great Bahama Bank. That would really kind of give us a clue about how isolated or not some of those populations may have been in the past, especially during times maybe with lower sea level or well before people got there. So we can augment these baselines. And I know I'm repeating stuff that you know from the Relic group, but a lot of the work that we have so far are kind of case studies now ready for these next steps, right? So if there is an interest, those data, and we can work with partners at AMMC and other Bahamian partners and scientists to kind of chase some of these questions from a deeper time perspective, if it is supportive of the B&T's, priorities and thoughts about other places to possibly, I don't know, help your priorities in modeling.
One thing I would add, so obviously this is not related to what the BNT's priorities were, so maybe that might be something great for them. But in terms of this assessment, we wouldn't want to we wouldn't be trying to estimate populations from pre-1500 and where we have these sort of lower water levels and that sort of thing, because we have our the cutoff to keep it more related to sort of modern day conservation and what's possible. And we might have examples where the population could possibly have reached so much higher levels in 1100, 1200 than it possibly could now. So in terms of green status timelines, when we're thinking about those population densities, we wouldn't want to go earlier than the benchmark year. But it sounds like you've got a lot of exciting data, which may be very relevant for other things. But just to add in there that if we have ideas of the population densities back in 1500, or we could calculate that in some way, that would be useful to have. But earlier than that would not be something that would be going into this kind of assessment.
Thank you.
So, oh, no worries, thank you. So just, conscious a little bit of the fact that we've got 10 minutes left of our time. So just quickly in terms of follow-ups, as I said, this is something that we're now at the stage of, we need expert input. So anyone who would like to be, if you would like to be included as an assessor on this, and then we'll continue to have kind of back and forth with you answering these questions and getting your contributions. Then the rest of that will be done largely through email, but then also we'll probably, I think we'd need to set up another call to once we've kind of ironed out some of these points, to go through the next steps. So I wonder if something that might be useful is if just kind of to get through the last of these sort of early steps, is Salome, if you could just do a little brief introduction as to your thinking on the functionality threshold, because that's something that's a bit of a challenge. And then people can start to have a think about it and maybe get back to us afterwards, and we can continue this conversation going after. So maybe if you could just give just a quick intro of that for this one.
Yeah, so for this species, it's something that it's really challenging to determine a functionality threshold, and it was something that I wanted to discuss with you as to what would be, because I couldn't find any information about density or abundance for the species in literature. So maybe this would be one of the species where a proxy would be relevant, a proxy species, or I don't know if any of you have information about densities that would make a population functional. But from my end, I couldn't find this information in my background research. I found functions that were described for the species in terms of its ecological role in its ecosystem, but no functionality threshold I found in the research.
Okay, cool. So yeah, very much a point that will need some discussion then, I think.
Yes.
So in terms of, just because I'm conscious of the time, in terms of next steps, so there's various resources that I've said that I'll share. So things like the training, the online training, and then we've got some other background resource information for the green status. We also have a form for if anyone's interested in starting another assessment, you can submit a form which would go through to the Red List unit, and you get support in that. So I wonder, is it best, Ancilleno, for me to share all of this with you, and then you can forward it on to the attendees if you have an attendee list?
Yeah, so everyone that's signed in should have their name show up inside my list on this end. And then when I distribute again for people to see the recording, they'll be able to communicate if they want additional information as well. And I'll share that with this green list team, this green status team, so that we can all be on the same page.
Perfect. So I'll send through those resources, and then for anyone who's interested in continuing to work with us on this assessment and contribute towards this assessment, we have, so Salome's put a lot of the information from this assessment into like a Word version as well as the Excel version. So we'd be able to go through and add comments. You can add comments into that. We potentially, actually, Salome, it might be useful for us to go, or for you to go through that and just put in the comments that were raised in this discussion, so that we know some of the things that we need to circle back to. And then, yeah, people can add their contributions to that. And this will just allow us to sort of continue collating the information, gathering background information from you, which Salome can then put into the workbook. And then the next stage, when we're thinking about kind of the different conservation interventions, I would suggest it would be useful to have another call to discuss those all together once we've got kind of all of the background thing. We're happy with the range and the spatial units and the functionality threshold. Does that sound, is everyone happy with that sort of process?
Yeah.
I think I'm good with that. Also, if anyone can share contact information for others that they think should be part of this process, but maybe did not join the call today. There's a lot of environmental issues happening in country right now. I definitely understand the prioritization for people's time. But if you have other ideas of people who should be involved, please send those to me.
Perfect. That'd be great. So, I mean, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today. And for everyone who's joined in with the discussions. We've already got a couple of discussion points that we're gonna be circling back to, and really useful to have your input. And as I said, there's only so much we can do with sort of background literature information, and this is the point where we really need input from experts like yourselves. So thank you very much for taking the time to do that.
Okay, everyone, thank you all for joining us today. And again, I'm Dr. Ancilleno Davis, and this is hosted by Science and Perspective, and it will be posted to the Science and Perspective YouTube channel, but it will actually be made so that it's not searchable, but people with the link can access it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Have a good rest of the day and evening.
You too. Thank you. Bye.